Hi, everybody. Welcome to another conversation with Isaac, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Linn Tonstad. Linn, thank you so much for joining us. Would you mind telling people who you are, where you're coming from, and just anything about yourself?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Linn. I teach gender and sexuality studies and Christian theology at Yale Divinity School. I work in the areas, I have this sort of academic line that I normally do, which is I do constructive theology at the intersection of systematic theology with feminist and queer theory, which is like word, right? But what that means is something like this. I try to think not only about the consequences of Christianity for how we should think about gender and sexuality questions, but also about the consequences of gender and sexuality questions for how we should think about Christianity.
So some of you from the congregation may recognize Linn's name because last spring we did a study on her introductory volume to Queer Theology. We did it actually exactly a year ago, randomly enough. But I'm interested, Linn, maybe to start out with a basic question. Your writing seems to be really interested in the church, the life of church in this modern era, like the questions that we're wrestling with. And I don't want to say that that's unusual these days, but I wonder if you would just, there is a live debate, I think, in theology about what the role of a theologian's writing and work is for the church. So I wondered if you just talk a little bit about why, did you write the Queer Theology book with the church as an intended audience? What is your relationship with sort of movements for LGBT inclusion in churches, anything like that?
Yeah, those are great questions. I definitely wrote the Queer Theology book was written for churches and for my students and for interested lay people, those sort of three categories, right? So my students being about a third people who are going on to work in nonprofit or other sort of contexts, about a third people who are going into the academy in some way, and about a third people who are going into traditional-ish forms of ministry. And we also know, right, that these topics around gender and sexuality have been, for reasons that I would argue are theologically terrible, have been central to the lives of churches over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years at this point. I know the Methodist Church has been particularly affected by this in the US recently, but this has happened in many different contexts, right? Where Christian churches have sort of decided, like, of all the things that Christians disagree about, and, that's more or less everything. The thing that Christians do is disagree with each other. What is the Christian tradition? Hey, let's disagree. That's what we do, right? Why has this one been sort of the thing? What do we think about that, right? Like, what's the theological status of the reality that so many churches have staked their lives and their communities on this one particular division, when you could think of so many others in Christian tradition and in biblical thought that would have been rather more plausible candidates, arguably, for these kinds of disagreements? So I'm very interested in that, right? I'm very interested in that, the dynamics of that decision. And I also come from a perspective where, for me, starting from relatively early on, in terms of when I was much younger than I am now, this has not been a live question. So for me, I came from a very non-affirming tradition, but once I recognized the mistake there, it was not a question of debate any longer. And it's one of the reasons why I argue that, apologetic arguments for why affirmation, why inclusion are the right move, are actually theologically and strategically speaking, to some extent a mistake, and to some extent a distraction from what we should actually be thinking about. And there's a lot more to say about that, obviously. But for me, there's a real worry about the consequences for Christianity of making this question central in the way it has been made. There's to me a pretty bad mistake that's happening there.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I kind of want to start just with this baseline thing that may seem shocking to a lot of people. I think it's, you know, one of the great hooks about your book to say, actually gender and sexuality has not always been thought about as something important to Christianity, and we should think about whether or not it actually is, should be at all. And so, like most things in churches these days, like, you know, scriptural interpretation, ecclesiology, gender and sexuality have a history of being thought about. What exactly did it look like when, in early forms or different ages in Christianity, when gender and sexuality were not as central? What, you know, how were they being thought about? What was the difference between then and now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, and I'm not a specialist in the early Christian material. I'm more like I read the conclusions of specialists, so that's where I'm coming from. That's my academic side, right? I'm like, don't think I'm the absolute expert here. But in general, right, like the speculative relation that many traditions in the early church had to questions of gender and sexuality, and it's already a little misleading to say that, because one of the points that gender and sexuality studies has taught us, thinking about gender and sex and sexual practices and desires, is the kind of historical relativity of what we take that to mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can assume in some sense that body, desire, love, attraction, attachment, all the things that go into that are present in some sense in people's lives, but everything lies in the in some sense, right? Because what those aspects of life are taken to mean, the significance they're taken to have, the centrality and the person constituting character, the way in which they make us who we are, those are deeply historically relative questions. And one of the really interesting and weird things about the early church and some other reform movements is how differently they sometimes thought about these things than we do. And this can include everything from, you know, somewhat unexpected assumptions, like thinking about one of the weird things about eunuchs being like they have so much more sexual desire than anybody else does in certain ancient formulations, right? Where you're like, oh, that might not have been exactly how most people would have assumed that would run. Or where you think about one of the disadvantages of women in sort of Roman thinking, again, being like, oh, they're so controlled by desire. They're so like oriented in these ways. In other words, what we take gender and sexuality to indicate about persons is deeply historically relative, historically contingent. That's number one. And number two, early Christianity often thought of these questions as both less and differently important than did many of the sort of surrounding cultural and social movements. And three, the ways in which they thought it was these questions were less important also involved a lot of really odd speculation around what might happen to gender and sexuality in the life to come, around what sort of ideal relationships in terms of gender and sexuality were. And we've lost a lot of that, I think, because of the way that gender and sexuality become person constituting. They make us who we are in a way that reflects the social and cultural developments that underlie modern capitalism and racial slavery, actually.
So I think that some people may, who are listening, may be familiar with the history here already because it's so commonly used in apologetic strategies to try to point out that Paul, you know, wasn't thinking about hetero or homosexuality as an identity, or he wasn't writing about a committed relationship between two queer people, or, you know, so on some level, like, this is a familiar thing, but I don't think that captures the reality of what you're talking about in quite the same way. So when we're thinking about what was at stake, like, so maybe it's helpful to pull out some of the modern pieces about what it means for gender and sexuality to define us as people today. So when you say something like that, what does that look like on a practical level?
It has everything to do with these sort of understandings of like real authentic personhood, who you actually are in your fullest self, and the way that that sense of self is tied to a particular orientation of desire, and the way that that orientation of desire is also reflective of divisions between public and private that are crucial to, again, the sort of formation of what I talk about in the book, and what is commonly referred to as the modern liberal subject, or something like that. The subject of personhood and rights, who in modernity is invented in a certain sense in contradistinction to the slave, who is constitutively the one who does not have personhood and rights in that way. And there's something really important here that we see immediately when we recognize that connection, which is that this understanding of the person deserving of rights, deserving of respect, deserving of affirmation, deserving of love, is, in a sense, in the very beginning, a distinguisher, an excluder, rather than an includer, right? In other words, this understanding of the person isn't built to include all people. It is built to distinguish some from others, right? To distinguish the subject who deserves and has rights from the one who doesn't, the slave. And so then gender and sexuality, increasingly for reasons having to do with, you know, stuff we can talk about with the modern rise of the modern state and the division of labor and the need for social reproduction and the privatization of social reproduction, all these sorts of themes around like the basic questions of like, how do you feed yourself, who feeds you, and who cares for those who can't care for and feed themselves, i.e. children, the elderly, and the otherwise differently abled. Those questions are the other side of making sexuality and gender so central to our sense of self. So this is all tied together. I agree with you, actually, that the general kind of Paul wasn't thinking about this strategy. There are two things to say about that, right? Of course, Paul wasn't thinking about this. And we don't know what Paul was thinking about, but we can be fairly certain he wasn't thinking about this, since these concepts didn't circulate in that way. We can't think about things we don't have words and ideas to think about. But also, do we think that Paul, to the extent that we can speculate about this, would have condemned any variety of forms of sexual and gender and erotic relations that are common? Of course he would have, right? Of course he would have. The question is, what's the status of that condemnation, right? What is going on there in Paul? Does it reflect other aspects of his and other early Christian insights around the nature of let's say, the rule of God, or the coming of the kingdom, as it were? Or are those aspects of his thinking maybe doing different kinds of work, right, than we often assume that they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I think maybe every good liberal Christian, whatever that means, has had their struggles with Paul. There are times of being away from him, and then times of maybe getting to a reasonable understanding with him. And I want to talk about that, but there's something I want to kind of pull out, a string I want to pull on a little bit more from what you said. So when you're talking about this liberal subject, you know, the listeners were like bouncing around several thousand years of philosophy and history and theology here. So I mean, you can spend your life dedicated to the discussion that we're having today. So, you know, if you're feeling some whiplash, don't worry about it. It's not your fault. But so when you're talking about the liberal subject and the subject being constituted in distinction from as having rights from the one who doesn't have rights. I mean, you know, if I'm trying to give a practical example of what that looks like, here at UVA, you know, I'm like less than 100 yards from the campus where there's this, you know, elaborate piece of classical architecture designed by Thomas Jefferson and then built by slave labor that, you know, we have these famous serpentine walls in between gardens that were designed by Jefferson to hide the presence of enslaved humans working from the eyes of students or faculty or, you know, people that were white people that were there because, and that's just a very practical and realistic sort of illustration of the difference between the liberal subject who's given rights, the one who is allowed to sort of see, but one who's also allowed to kind of see over and not see the labor that their lifestyle is built upon. So it becomes this kind of partition between the cost, the human cost, literally in blood, sweat, and tears of the lifestyle that was being sort of put in place here at UVA. And in many ways, you know, the pandemic right now is a perfect example of that continuing. So, you know, the essential workers who are being paid starvation wages in order for us to continue our lives right now in quarantine and yet putting themselves at risk is another way. So we, you know, through the advent of delivery, grocery delivery or food delivery or whatever else, there's this new thing that I've noticed where you can select on like Grubhub or whatever a type of drop off where there's no contact. You know, I don't want to see the person who's bringing me this food, and I don't have to because I'm through capital or through whatever else able to receive that food without understanding anything about its production. Do you want to throw anything there? I was just trying to think of practical ways to kind of define what that subjecthood means.
I think that's exactly right. And it's exactly what I've been thinking about so much since the pandemic really hit the United States, which is dealing with this situation in what are, at least so far, clearly worse ways than any other country in the world, which is, that's an amazing fact, but it is also a fact so far. You know, what does it mean to be in a country that starts from this language? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those who write that statement own other human beings who are not endowed, apparently, with the right to, let's just take the obvious one, liberty.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be trained to believe in that statement, to see it as true in some sense, in the very moment that it is a blatant lie, right? What practice in speaking, what practice in thinking, and as you so beautifully just illustrated, what practice in seeing does that engender, does that result in, right? And what we're seeing right now is exactly, you know, the sort of the story of America in particular. And you know, we're so much in the middle of this. I live in New York. We're so much in the middle of this right now. But the story of America is one in which the defense is always there by saying, oh, they didn't quite understand yet what the implications of those words were. It's a sort of, it's a horizon where we're always coming closer to that. It's never yet fully realized, but we're always working towards it. It's always the sort of direction in which we're going. And that way, you always have a get out of jail free card in a certain sense for any particular failure in the enactment of the theoretical ideal. But what if the theoretical ideal isn't a theoretical ideal, but a practical learning how to speak and see in a way that lets you see some things and explicitly forbids you from seeing others in a certain sense? And that's exactly from seeing what you're saying right now, that the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that some of us are able to pursue, right? You were talking about we're ranging over these vast swaths of history and you can devote your life. And I'm like, yep, right here. Yep, that's what I do. That's what I do. I sit around thinking about this, reading about this, learning about this, trying to understand exactly this. How is it that we sort of believe this one story so intensely when it is also so evident that that story is not the story? It's the story that in a way motors the real story, the story of sacrificing others for the sake of our rights and privileges.
Yeah, and I think that it's so funny when you're talking about, like, you know, moving towards the full meaning of that text that made me think of like Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, where you're just kind of like, you're always on that journey to the real meaning. But I think that, you know, the other thing that I just thought about that illustrates all of this really beautifully is the movie Parasite that came out last year by Bong Joon-ho. It won the Oscar for Best Picture. You know, that anyway, if you're looking for another way of talking about especially seeing and different sort of, I mean, he even kind of gives it like an architecture, you know, the levels of soul that they're in South Korea, of like who gets flooded and when there's a terrible storm and who doesn't, and things like that. But anyway, if you haven't seen that movie, check it out. I think it's on Hulu right now. But you know, but I think the thing that you're trying to say is that, I mean, we hear this all the time in Charlottesville because of, you know, the terrorist attack here in 2017, especially around these statues, the Confederate statues here, like, oh, well, Robert E. Lee, basically good person, Thomas Jefferson, good people, but like they just didn't understand. But the reality is that the American project and the governmental project of the Enlightenment coming out of Europe is that this is intentionally what they're working towards in the creation of law. How can we continue to delineate who has rights and who doesn't? And, you know, my church sees this now through the way that our government treats Maria, the asylum seeker who lives with us. She's in sanctuary here precisely because no government on earth will give her or recognize her rights as a human being. She's in this neutral space where, you know, no one is willing to accept responsibility for her existence from the perspective of political rights. And so because of that, her mobility is completely limited to this space, the private property that the church owns here in Charlottesville. And I think that it's a good illustration of what not being recognized in that system can do to you, like the very literal limits of freedom that it places on you when you're not the person that these rights are created to assist and to further and to reproduce, which is ultimately where I think we get to you know, kind of the way that sexuality gets ingrained in all of this. Can you talk about that? Because you don't just claim, I mean, thinking about both Queer Theology, but also your first book, God and Difference, you don't just claim that like sexuality is, you know, what you do with your genitals, but also that it's kind of baked into the heart in some ways of Christian theology, but also into sort of our modern culture. Can you say more about what that means?
Keep it simple, right?
You can pick one. How about just, you know, in the church even, like what does reproduction mean there or something like that?
Well, right. So I think a lot about how we're trained to speak and see and act, and about what function theology has and can have in relation to these kinds of questions. And right now, one of the things that keeps coming up in both queer theological discussion, in discussion around questions of ecology, in discussions around question of consumption, capitalism, you know, climate change, everything sort of related to that, we want in some ways to have this conversation around like, what does theology have to say to this, right? Like, what is a good theological basis for inclusion, for affirmation, for responsible consumption, for you know, ecological restraint, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's the one thing, right? Like, good theological arguments for this are not difficult to find. They're a dime a dozen. They lie in the very heart of every fundamental Christian conviction, or at least convictions that are taken to be fundamental, around God's love for the world, God's desire that creation and people flourish, the questions of relationality and togetherness, the interdependence of humans and the rest of the created order on each other, the direct relation of all that is to God. I could just keep going, right? Like, there are so many good arguments for these questions. So is theology's job to produce the good arguments? Maybe, right? That's not a useless task, but it might not serve that much of a function, because it doesn't, like, making the good arguments doesn't necessarily wrestle with the next and really fundamental question, which is, if the arguments are so obvious, and they are, why aren't we doing those things? What is it that stops us individually, collectively, and of course, sociopolitically, economically, whatever we call that whole thing that is us in the broadest sense, recognizing what historians are going to write about us in the time of COVID, recognizing that to live in the United States right now in the time of COVID will mean for most of us to be written about similarly to slaveholders, to bystanders in Nazi Germany, to all of the villains of our imaginations. We are the ones who will be the future subjects of that. That's the reality of what's going on right now. Does theology have anything to say about that? It seems to me a couple of things. One is theology is one of the places where we clearly see how you learn to say all men are created equal and mean by that, definitely not, right? Because theology is another place where there's a real and fundamental risk of always letting the ideal trump the reality. Always letting that God loves everybody trump the reality that in my practice, I do not. So that's the danger of theology. And to some extent, Christianity in its worst moments is a training in telling that lie about myself, right? About my own desires, about my own relation to the good. Oh, I see that God loves everybody. Maybe you don't, but I see that from my so that's the danger. That's the real, and church is by no means alone in this. It's not like the greatest villain or anything like that. Assigning responsibility in that way isn't particularly helpful anyway. But church is one, like the danger of church is that through a variety of different strategies, and in my writing, I've looked at some of the more complicated ones that aren't exactly like, I think I'm good, but I recognize I'm bad and you think you're good, so that you can, there's many tricky levels of this. But the worst danger of church is that, right? Like it's learning to speak in ways that always let the ideal cancel out the real. So that's the really negative side of this in my understanding. The other side of this is that Christianity can be a place now it's best in a certain sense. It can be one of the ways that we learn to think about what's happening in the world and the resistances that we have, the depths of those resistances. What, a certain tradition, not always that popular in the Methodist Church, talks about as total depravity, right? or something, and it doesn't have to be going all in on original sin, right? Like I've done that on occasion. I have some, I think about it as a question at least. But what would it look like instead, in a way, to think about theology as one way of helping us to understand how people actually work, right? Helping us to understand, to give us tools for recognizing, among other things, the depth and difficulty of transformation, its costliness, how, in a certain sense, and I don't mean here like the valorization of sacrifice for its own sake, because I think that's one of the big mistakes. We see this right now. Oh, well, yes, some people are going to have to die so we can reopen the economy, right? So you make the economy this thing that doesn't exist in reality, in a certain sense of reality. You make it the realist thing. And then you make people into this sort of incidental to the economy, as though the economy is something other than the activities of people, which it is not, right? Even, and I don't mean this in the sense of like manufacturing and production. I mean this in the sense of like financial capital and calculation and bookkeeping and betting and all the things that are like the economy. The economy is what people do. And it, at the same time, we talk as though it exists, right? In this sort of separate realm where people are sort of participating in it or not participating in it. And,
the market.
Yeah, exactly. And we make it this real thing that exists somehow apart from us and our activities. That's the big mistake. And Christianity, one of the traditional languages for talking about this that has, again, as always, there are pluses and minuses to it, but is idolatry, right? Is to make real actors out of things that are our own activities. And theology can help us see the dangers of that. It can help us see how deep that goes in us. And it can help us understand, I think, at its best, the depth of transformation and the kinds of transformation that are needed in order to not exactly stop doing that, because we're going to do it, right? But to find ways to counteract our doing of it, and to, in a way, at least start to accept our participation in these practices. Unfortunate and undesirable though it is to see those things about ourselves.
Well, I mean, I want to say one word in defense of John Wesley and Methodism before I get accused of Pelagianism, but you know, the only theological treatise he ever wrote is on original sin. I mean, we're fully invested in that reality. It's just, you know, what grace does and what it's allowed to do is where things with Calvinism go in a different direction, I think.
And I'm not saying it needs to be I'm not even saying it needs to be original sin, right?
I know.
It's one way of talking. The question is, if we understand the complexity of the different forces that go into producing the situation that we're in right now, right? Just going again with the sort of the time that is COVID time right now. One of the things about this situation that's very difficult and costly to understand in some ways is the real depravity, the real active malevolence, what no language short of wickedness is helpful for talking about some of what's happening right now. So that's but that's not the only thing that's going on, right? Another contributor to what's going on is things that are in and of themselves relatively innocent, if that's a meaningful term, aspects of human existence. The way we, now meaning broadly speaking, public culture in the West, we're sort of going on hearing, oh, these reports from China, oh, how interesting what's happening over there. And then we, again, meaning broadly speaking, public culture in the West, we're like, oh, there's this tragedy happening in Italy. How awful. That must be really terrible. And we're sort of like, tra-la-la, in a way, you know, like, oh, we're watching this. And then, you know, whatever date you pick in March, we're like, oh, us.
Yeah.
Oh. And that's not necessarily the effect of wickedness or malevolence, right? It's the effect of certain cognitive structures, certain ways of thinking are sort of biased towards the everyday, the difficulty of recognizing radical change in advance of its arrival. You know, behavioral economists and so on will talk all kinds of language for these sorts of things. But these aspects of the way we think aren't necessarily culpable in a sense of moral guilt and responsibility. They're part of how we are. It's a question of how then these parts of how we are that aren't necessarily morally culpable, that aren't necessarily responsible, guilty in these ways, then come to interact with a variety of other aspects of human existence, the way we think, the way we've organized ourselves politically, socially, economically, to then produce massive, unnecessary human suffering.
Right. So there's so much here, and I think that if you're listening and thinking, I thought this was going to be about like gay people or something. I promise.
It is though, but we can get to
that. We have not gone as far off the path as you might think. So let me kind of tie it all together, because I think it gets to one of like the most important parts of your book, and I think one of the more difficult aspects of I mean, just from a pastoral perspective, something that I see people wrestle with a lot. They don't like to hear what we're about to talk about, but yet it's like, to me, a source of tremendous grace. But I think that, you know, when we're talking about, when we are thinking about things like, okay, what sort of part of our behavior is morally culpable, and what part of it is like just related to our failure to literally be omniscient beings. This is a central question for like what it means to be a person and queer theology has a lot to say about it. And the biggest thing that it has to say is that we're not capable of fully knowing ourselves in all spaces and at every moment. That's in some ways, I guess, a definition of what it means to be God, if you want to talk about anything. And yet that's sort of the central temptation that we face, right, through sin, is the original sort of temptation there is this thing will make you like God. I think that there's a lot to say about how capitalism plays on that desire. You know, this thing will make you impenetrable is at the heart of a lot of Jesus's calls to vulnerability in the parables. But I think that, you know, one of the things that you're trying to say is that, at least what I'm hearing, sort of interpreting and translating to you is that the church has for a long time been a place where we kind of get this ideal picture of an unreality, of a world that just doesn't exist. And part of what queer theology is trying to do, and especially as it relates to sexuality. So let me like dig down into a practical application here. You know, the nuclear family. It's this thing that the church has been deeply invested in. Amy Laura Hall came and preached at my church last year, and she talked about this practice in Methodism in the 1950s and 60s of picking a best family from each church and having, and it went up to a district level and then a conference level. And then there would be a general best family in the entire Methodist church that was like chosen every single year. And like, so that, and yet at the same time, many people are struggling with divorce, struggling with infidelity, struggling with abuse and the difficulty of raising children in a system that is really cruel to them. Like, and yet we're sitting here every year parading a best family out of every congregation in order to kind of create this unreal notion that this is what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to have the 2 kids and the loving spouse and all that crap. And so I think part of what queer theology tries to do is call attention to the fact that a lot of that is just not real. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's not even real within that family's life. But I think it also wants to call us into relationship to each other's pain. You know, Wolfhart Pannenberg is a person you've written a lot about. When I was thinking about being an academic, I was also writing a lot about him. And, you know, he has this image in the eschaton of like people getting to, you know, on the last day, like meeting Christ, and there's like sort of harmonious music that is the rule of God, and then the dissonance of sin being introduced to that, and like suddenly everyone for the first time understands the true reality of the world that they were living in and all the pain that they were related to that they never saw. And there's this like just horrible noise in his sort of depiction of it, right? And then Christ kind of harmonizes it out. But I think that's it. You know, Ruby Sales has this admonition to for people to be more honest with each other about their relationship to each other's pain. And I think at some point we can talk about, you know, where it's just the fact of like human finitude or sin that keeps us from being able to recognize those things. But this is what we're trying to get at when we're talking about sort of these structures that make it difficult to understand, you know, what's going on around us, and how Christian theology, queer theory kind of tries to articulate a different vision of the person that paints just a more realistic picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a beautiful example. I hadn't heard that story of the best family. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's something else.
And it gets to so many different aspects, right? Like, on the one hand, the sort of the founding axiom / rule, right, that I quote over and over again in my writing of queer thinking is, you know, people are different from each other. It's amazing how few good theoretical tools we have for thinking about this simple fact. It's axiom 1 from one of the founding books of queer theology by Neve Sedgwick. And I think so much about that, right? Because people are different from each other includes so many things, including that forms of life that don't work for me work very well for others. And so queer theology is not in that sense about being like, we all need to be in this one particular way. We all need to live in this one particular way, but rather a few different things. One is recognizing limitation, the limitations that are inevitable, that have to do with finitude, with being created limited beings. We are created to be limited. There's nothing wrong with that. Limitation is possibility for creatures, not for God, arguably, but for creatures, that's true. Another is distortion, right? The way that even the best kinds of things, even my best desires, even my most fulfilling relationships, both have some distortions to them and can become especially distorted in how we relate to each other. And we're seeing a version of that, I think, right now that has to do with your family example. I was on a conference call related to work a few days ago, and everybody was talking about, what have you been doing in the time of COVID? And a lot of people are like, well, my life hasn't really changed much. I'm staying home with my family, I'm gardening, and, it seems to be fine. I'm spending a lot of time baking, I'm doing these things. And, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's great. My lifestyle has changed a lot. The absence of other people outside my household, the distance from that and screen mediation, for me means the loss of almost all the most significant sources of pleasure, joy, and satisfaction in my life, right? Because for me, pleasure, joy, and satisfaction have to do with the bodily presence of other people. They have to do with relationships, with presence, with, bodies being together in the same space, which is one of the main things that interests me. And the invisibility of one of these to the other, right? And the way that the kind of loss of what we might think about as some kinds of public relations right now, like the possibility of intimacy with strangers. And I mean here intimacy in the broadest possible sense, like the unexpected encounter, that smile that you exchange with somebody when you sort of see something funny on the street or whatever the case may be. Like those losses for me are dramatically the loss of some of the things that are the point of life, right? That are the part of not mere survival, but the thing that is not mere survival about existence. And one of these things, the possible satisfactions of an enclosed home, is contingent on the ongoing existence and subtraction of satisfaction from that other sphere. The thing you were talking about, the delivery people, the people who are still coming to our doors, to that impenetrable frontier. And this is not a complaint about the shutdown. The shutdown is necessary. I support it wholeheartedly. It's not that. But it is something about recognizing both like cost and the different distribution of cost that's going on right now. That there are forms of life that are essentially dependent on sacrifices that are mostly invisible inside those forms of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it gets back, we should have done this interview on May Day because I feel like this is a big workers of the world unite.
That's absolutely correct.
But I think that, right now we're seeing furloughs at UVA Medical of essential staff. I mean, they're furloughing nurses, and it's like, okay, what about, 2 weeks ago, every nurse was a hero, and now, they're non-essential. And I think that it gets back to this question of like, what actually is creating value? And I think that it's funny, some of the ways that we've seen people like honor people who are basically being put on the slaughter bench, to borrow a Hegelian term, but like, some of the things have been really ridiculous. Like you can go to Krispy Kreme and get 5 dozen donuts if you work at the University of Tennessee Medical Center, where a sibling of mine does, and it's like for free. That's as a thank you for putting your life on the line. And it's like, well, I think they take PPE and proper hazard pay instead, or that. But I think that ultimately, what I want to drill down into this question that you raised about people being in spaces together, because I think it's ultimately what kind of motivates a lot of my thinking around this, and one of the things that churches need to really think about, because there are ways that what you're describing right now gets back to a lot of what's at the heart of some of your first book, God and Difference, which is about theologies that are sort of based on this idea that people can't take up space together, that one person has to be sacrificed for another person to be present. And there's a lot tied up in that about sexuality and gender. So can I just kind of throw that up to you as a softball to say, what is it, how are these competing visions sort of present in our visions of Christianity, and how might queer theology sort of challenge those?
Yeah, I mean, the central image or the two central images, they're two sides of one image of Christianity, right? One is a feast, a meal, a celebration at which you are present with someone who will hand you over unto death, someone who will betray you, and you do it anyway. You know that, you know one of you will betray me, and you do it anyway. You sit down, you share the feast with that person. That's the one image. And that's the one that has something to do with the reality of how things are, that we will betray each other, we will fail each other, we will have antagonistic relations, etc., etc. And then the other image is Jesus is saying, I will not eat of eat or drink of the food, drink of the eat of the bread, drink of the wine, etc., until the kingdom. But the Eucharistic feast is the central image of the kingdom, at which all come together in a single, whatever place means here, right? It means something like bodily, real presence together with the people I most dislike, right? It's one of the few images from C.S. Lewis that I still really love, is this basic sort of, you know, what's the magic of church at its best? It's that you have to kneel next to people you really hate. He puts it somewhat differently than that, but I think it's, I like that part of it, right? It's the reality that even that antagonism, it's not overcome necessarily, but you do it anyway. You come together anyway. And there is maybe a promise of overcoming, and but a recognition too that overcoming requires real transformation. And then the question becomes, how do we work towards an inadequate version of that, right? Like, how do we, in a certain sense, create the feast at which one of you will betray me, recognizing that feast is for the sake of, there will be an end to sacrifice, there will be an end to betrayal, there will be an end to one of us must yield so that others may find satisfaction, may exist. And that's where you know, I've used in part of my writing this image of the sodomite, right? Which is it's a fascinating image, because the way it's often been used in queer theology, and Kent Brittenell has a wonderful piece on this, the way it's often been used in queer theology is this, like, oh, the real sin of Sodom wasn't, you know, homosexuality, it was rape. Or the real sin of Sodom wasn't even homosexuality or rape, it was economic exploitation, you know, the sort of Ezekiel image of what went wrong in Sodom.
Or like,
and, you know,
a lack of hospitality or something.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, the absence of hospitality to strangers, the luxury, the sort of excessive desire that the sodomites have, that's like, then it becomes this sort of image for capitalism and consumption. And one of the interesting things about the sodomite, and, you know, Mark Jordan has written about this, there's an art historian, Robert Mills, who's written about this in a book that I just think is really, really fun, called Seeing Sodomy in the Middle Ages. The way that sodomy becomes this sort of slip-sliding figure for a variety of differences that are kind of antagonistic to, like, good, proper, ordered Christian sociality. So sodomy in the Middle Ages, like when it's portrayed sort of artistically, the thing that we think of as sodomy can mean age-differentiated relationships, sort of age-inappropriate relationships, or it can mean a relationship between a cleric and a lay person, or it can mean a Jew, or it can mean a Muslim, or it can mean somebody who's excessively greedy for money, right? And so what becomes very interesting is the way that the sodomite, as a sort of figure for indecent sexuality, let's say, is also a figure for all these many other differences that become constituted, that become made into a threat to kind of good Christian social togetherness, right? And so then, and this gets back to your workers' point, what happens if, in a sense, we take the side of the sodomites, right? If we recognize in a way that the issue isn't who is the sodomite, like who is the real enemy, it's rather the dynamic of producing that enemy to begin with, right? And one of the things I think queer theology can really help us with is exactly the clarity of how the improperly sex-gendered subject becomes a threat to good and decent church, right? We've all seen that. Whichever side you take in that debate, we've all seen it. And we've seen it very, very clearly, right? The danger is the homosexual or the trans person, right? Who refuses to accept their God-given destiny, you know, et cetera, and then kind of like, you know, is this kind of danger, et cetera, right? We know that one. And then when we know it, can we recognize that it is just one particularly clear version of something that's going on all the time in any number of different contexts, inside and outside church? the externalization of threat, the making other of the one who is the danger to my understanding of what good sociality should look like. And then that's where we really get going with thinking about both the inevitability of that and how do we interrupt it? How do we interrupt its effects? What can we do there? And you know, that's the real ethical task, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's the hard work.
Right. And I want to drill down into this because I think it's really important, because this language of like, oh, go to the margins, and it's so prevalent in extremely privileged inclusive churches, right? Like, you know, we want to be in solidarity with the marginalized, and yet nobody knows any non-white people or something like that. So I mean, I think it's something about, there's something deeper though about the nature of what you're talking about. It's not that, you know, when we're talking about deviance and like who is sort of made other by society, there's something in your book that you talk through, or you think through, with Outhouse Reed, where she says that queerness isn't oddity, it's something more than that. So it's not, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And then especially in line with the fact that she ultimately says queerness belongs to God, and we are made queer by grace from God. So how do those things kind of work together? This kind of othering and deviancy that's created by society, and somehow that being also a gift from God. Is that what she means, or how do you think about those things?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And you're picking up on some of my favorite bits of her thinking, obviously. You know, I've done something that in my writing that is obviously illegitimate in a certain sense, which is that I've quasi-systematized Outhouse Reed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I've quasi-made a system out of something that is intentionally unsystematic. And I've been very clear, I've tried to be very clear that I'm doing that for reasons, but there is a danger there, right? Which is to sort of try to then produce a kind of strong account of what she's saying. But I think if we translate some of it into relatively ordinary terms, your point about privilege and marginalization, and the way that marginalization and a desire to be close to marginalization becomes a way actually of inhabiting rather than denying privilege, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we see this in contemporary social justice conversations around the figure of the Black trans woman, who becomes the ultimate marginalized figure, and in so doing, the object of desire, in a certain sense, for everybody who wants to be on the side of the good, right?
Yeah.
And in that moment, what about the Black trans woman? What about the Black trans woman? She becomes reduced to a figure for my self-realization, in a certain sense. At least that's the danger. If the Black trans woman isn't getting to speak for herself in a certain way, if she doesn't get to be as complex, as messy, as contradictory, as difficult as everybody else is too, right? That's the one side of it. The need, in a way, to there's a writer called Avery Gordon who talks about this in terms of simple and complex personhood. She talks about the way that marginalized subjects are often only given simple personhood. You have to, in a way, be the sort of sum total of your marginalization. Because you are marginalized in X way, you will react in Y way. Well, that's a form of mastery, right? It's a way of making the marginalized serving my interests, my understanding, my goodness, my, you know, and it's not that those things are necessarily bad in and of themselves. It's that those things have to be, in a certain sense, disciplined by real encounter, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in really quickly, I mean, we see this all the time when we sort of ascribe a moral heroism to the poor, like, oh, this poor person's on food stamps, but they smoke cigarettes, or like, you know, they should have no pleasure. They should be allowed nothing of their own except this sort of monastic lifestyle or something. Sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely, right? And the way that people who understand these things tell us, you know, what's one of the best things you can do for the poor or for someone who asks you for money on the street? Give them money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's not that complex. And you know, the way people have been talking about now under COVID, like if you're feeling guilty about being relatively untouched by it, here's a solution: give money, right? Give money to people who need money. It's a weird way to solve a problem, but it actually, right, it's the most fundamental thing in a way, given the way that money works. So that's the one side. And then the other side, right, is what would have to change for, let's say, Black trans women in their diversity from each other, in their different relations to each other, to live freely and to live more with fewer forms of disproportionate suffering being inflicted on them. What would it take to, for instance, free more people from sexual violence? Well, that would require prison abolition.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you want to think about sexuality and sexual violence, if you want to think about the thing that we call rape culture, the thing about rape culture isn't just privileged men exploiting relatively privileged women for access, or relatively disprivileged women in a context where there are so many hierarchies of privilege. It's not just the reality of prison rape and sexual violence in prison. It's the enforcement of standards of good gender and sexual behavior on not only imprisoned populations, but populations that are disproportionately subject to policing and to disprivilege. You know, I saw somebody say the other day, you talk about abolition as though it's this completely unimaginable ideal, but abolition is already a reality in many ways for very privileged white subjects.
Mm-hmm.
In very privileged white contexts, let's say the Donald Rumsfelds or the Henry Kissingers of the world, they've experienced prison abolition, right? Like prison abolition is absolutely real for them. So what does that mean in terms of what we can imagine as the horizon of our social activism, right? And if you haven't seen it, by the way, there's a, yeah, but I mean, right? Like it's the reality of it. What if we talked about that truth?
Yeah. I mean, it's just making me think of George W. Bush's call to unity that's been, plastered over everything. And, he's a United Methodist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's, it's a sad reality for our denomination that our two most prominent members of our church are Hillary Clinton and George W. Bush. Just like,
well, I came from Ben Carson's church, so I see you and I raised you, possibly in some sense. He was like the hero of my childhood because the special pediatric surgeon, the one who made it in the grand world. But then to bring this back to Althouse Reid, right? Like that point, she says, not only she says that line that you just quoted about we're made divinely queer by grace, but she talks about this line that I also quote over and over again, which is that queer holiness is always the holiness of the other. And what that means, right? Like my other, the one against whom I see my own kind of antagonism, the one I see as a threat to myself, recognizing the inescapability of that dynamic. And then in a way, how to work to relatively make less powerful the capacity for me to translate my own sense of real vulnerability into violence against others. And I think it's important to recognize the reality of vulnerability. We often talk in social justice contexts about, people who don't recognize their vulnerability. But one of the things that we're seeing right now is that people know they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons we're violent to each other. So recognition of vulnerability might not be enough. It might, in fact, be one of the dynamics that generates violence. How do we then negotiate around vulnerability in a way that makes it easier to interrupt that tendency from my real sense of threat to turn into actual violence against those who are significantly more threatened than I am at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into something that I think is really challenging about your work, because in the Queer Theology book and maybe from the field as a whole, but that question of how do we open up the space for vulnerability. I mean, I think that a lot of stereotypes about sort of woke culture or whatever social justice spaces is that they actively work for this sort of sameness, but what we've been talking about for a while now is exactly the sort of like heart of it is this notion that people are different, and how do you make space for that difference in a way that is non-competitive. And I think that I think something I've sort of, the way I've kind of put it is how can we like live lives without domination, and or what form of life does Christianity try to suggest? What would that look like? But I think that a lot of people want to say, okay, well, it's just a matter of the right, sort of symbolism and signs and liturgy, or slogan, or like if you just have a community formed around the right kind of reading, that'll just take. But you challenge that notion in the book, and I want to hear why. Like, why is that insufficient?
I mean, how I wish that were true, right?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
I wish it were that way, as someone who's devoted her life to reading, writing, and interpreting imagery, right? Like, and producing symbolism and reinterpreting symbolism. I so wish, I've written about clit licking God, right? I wish that would transform things in a certain way. But part of my writing about that is the recognition that especially alone will not have transformative relations. So how do we test change? Well, how bodies move through space is a really fundamental one, right? You talked about Maria, who's staying in your church at this point. And that is somebody whose body cannot move through space in certain ways right now, right? So what would it look like to have a church that was changing? Well, different kinds of bodies would have to be able to move freely in and through that space, right? And that would mean that to be in church would be near bodies you don't want to be near in various senses, right? There are many directionalities to that. But that's kind of the test. And changing imagery is fun and playful and can be theologically and doctrinally significant, right? Like I'm still invested in doctrine in some ways. I'm still invested in trying to think about the consequences of God's action in the world for how we engage in the world. But it is always a question of how we engage in the world. Does my presence in spaces contribute to other bodies moving freely through those spaces? How do I help to constitute spaces in which bodies can move more freely? And I mean here spaces, everything from the sidewalk to my home, to my classroom. See, my classroom, right? That's my possessive thing, right? I want to, it's my class. It's got to be done the way it is. And how do we learn in a way from spaces where marginalized bodies move more freely? And how do we expand those spaces? How do we transform, quote unquote, our spaces in ways that invite that? That's where representation in a way won't help us as much as real encounter, because bodies are diverse, read differently, read more complexly than symbols typically do. And so symbols at their best will sort of follow work that bodies are already doing. But it's the bodies, it's us, because we are the body. That's the nature of being created, is that we are the body, not necessarily reductively, but it is what we are. And the body is how we communicate, both visually and in every other sense in terms of encounter. So bodied encounter is sort of where change happens. It's where we learn. It's where we reinterpret. And we can then, I think, translate out of that into thinking differently about our symbols and how they function. But the encounter is the real work.
So what you're telling me is that listening to just NPR and never Fox News isn't going to make me a good person.
I mean, sorry.
Well, but I do kind of want to drill down on this a little bit more, because I think this is an interesting point of view, because for a lot of contemporary discussions, because I think that this is so clearly something that's been diagnosed repeatedly since 2016 as sort of like the failure of our, or like the sort of poison injected in the system is through media or through these signs or things like that. So like, I mean, but I hear you talking about a formation. So what is like, how do we account for that malformation that comes from what people think as like the wrong inputs culturally? Like where does the rubber meet the road there from? Is it the Fox News or the CNN that's making people hyper partisan, or is it something else different that has to do with lived reality?
I mean, it's a really good and complex question. If anyone who follows me on Twitter will know that there are probably few institutions in this world that I hate and despise more than the New York Times, right?
Oh,
I
yeah.
see the New York Times, to some extent the Washington Post, but especially the New York Times, as one of the worst actors on the face of the planet. And there are all kinds of reasons for that we could talk about some other time. So I'm not indifferent to the effects of representation, to the contrary, right? One of the things I'm most concerned about is the way that certain kinds of mal-representation in relation precisely to ideals of justice become engines of a sort of ongoing engagement in the culture that they theoretically pretend to oppose, right? Something like that. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about that. But where does the formation take place? It takes place everywhere, right? One of the obvious examples is how bodies become disciplined in space. Like, I'm now, into middle age, and I still find it difficult to sit still, right? And I think a lot about this because in the classroom, because I'm the instructor, I can move freely in the space, right? Mm-hmm. I can move through the lecture hall, I can kind of come closer, go farther away, etc. And I think about all the years, people who come into my classrooms have typically been in classrooms for maybe 20 years of their life so far. All the years of training it takes to become a docile body in the classroom, to control bodily liveliness in a way that allows for sort of productivity. That's one of the fundamental modes in which we learn how to inhabit space, right? We learn to sit still, to control our bodily needs, to express them only in certain ways at certain times. And we learn who gets to move freely in which space. And that starts at the latest by the time we get into something like kindergarten or first grade or preschool or whatever the case may be. And it's one of those most fundamental sort of forms of bodily training. We don't recognize how difficult it is because it starts so early. And we don't recognize its consequences because it feels so natural. So what, in a way, does it look like? And disability activists have written about this in part in like church spaces where the differently abled can run around and make noise, right? Like, what would it look like to produce spaces that didn't require that kind of docility from bodies, and that instead could, in a way, like foster unruliness or something like that, and also allow for the unruliness that already exists?
Yeah. I mean, so we, in my church, we've been kind of thinking about this idea of queer is holy, and it's something that we have been saying and talking about, especially in this season of the United Methodist Church kind of splitting itself up. And I think that it's one of the fundamental things about it is, kind of room for surprise in worship, and a spontaneity even that I think people are so anemic to. They're so frightened to like make the wrong sound in church, and I think that there's so much going on with that is a completely different conversation. But I do want to ask one other question, because I think that ultimately a lot of inclusive churches, one of the things that's surprising also in your book is just something you talk about in your approach to, like, okay, inclusive churches, non-inclusive. We've gotten into this point where you said, and everybody knows, where basically every mainline denomination is split over the issue of gender and sexuality. And churches are becoming more and more like either or spaces through that. But one of the things you talk about is this notion that you read in Paul about freedom of, like, if, he's talking about in the terms of food, if food offered to sacrifice to idols is a stumbling block for someone in your congregation, then you shouldn't eat it, or something like that. And you kind of interpolate that into this question of inclusion, and your approach, kind of bringing this all back to apologetics, is, maybe just let people who are not inclusive be. Is that what you mean? Or what exactly, how are you thinking about that, sort of as we think about freedom and spaces that people inhabit?
Yeah, it's a good question, and uncomfortable though part of that implication is. I don't make arguments for inclusion. I just exist in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And I've seen in my own life and history what will get movement going in this regard is people doing that, right? Is we've seen so many times the conservative Christian who changes their mind once a loved one comes out in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the following after of apologetic arguments, right? They're if they're useful at all, and I think even in this case, they're much less useful than people think. Again, because I work on arguments, I would love if they were more effective. It is what I do, is to make arguments. I so wish that, right? But unfortunately. But so people change their minds through encounter, through relation, and through attachment, right? And they also change their minds by coming into contact with communities that have done the difficult work of becoming other. What is it in not doing that work so much? Well, it's really costly. It's actually costly, right? To become a body that is a target of regulation for those who aren't already made into such bodies, i.e. mostly differently raced bodies, but with class playing a very significant role as well, it's really expensive. It's embarrassing. It's stigmatizing, right? It's not this very nice sort of like, look at me being so radically different and fluid from you. It requires a completely different relation to certain kinds of privilege, says the person who just got tenure at Yale, right?
I mean,
it's expensive, right? And it's not easy to do from certain positions. So if you can't then in a way very easily, or if you don't for various reasons, we should all be in jail, right? Like protesting what the United States is doing on a daily basis. Well, I don't want to go to jail, right? That's the reality of it. I don't want to be imprisoned. So then, given that there are sacrifices that I should be making by any ethical standard and that I'm unwilling to make, what's the next best thing in a way that I can do? Well, it's to work towards the transformation of spaces. It's to work against the logics of incarceration that require incarceration of some bodies, and that also mean that any kind of opposition itself becomes a sort of carceral target, a target of imprisonment, right? But there is something very, very uncomfortable in how expensive it is actually to do the good work in that sense. As far as non-inclusive churches, at the end of God and Difference, I basically say conservative Christians decided that we have to die on this hill. So on some level, we have to die on this hill, right? Like I have been very clear in my work in the insistence on the uncomfortable but very possible and real sort of co-presence of Christianity and queerness, whatever that's taken to mean. And I'll die on that hill, right? Like I will never concede in any conceivable context, including the making of an apologetic argument, that this should be a question about the possible co-reality of Christianity and queerness. That is not a question. Being queer, being trans, etc., is not in opposition to the kingdom of God. That is the reality of the kingdom of God, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
Given how much work there is to do in the world, and given how all-encompassing dynamics of stigmatization are, is it my primary job then to go and take that fight in a way to those who are in opposition here? For me, it's not. For me, the most effective strategy is simply to exist, right? To exist forcefully, to make this claim, but not to make it against, not to make it in a certain sense like toward, but instead to try to inhabit towards a different reality that will have its own seductive power, to be part of what, we might sarcastically talk about as the homosexual recruitment army, right? In a certain sense, to show that there can be another way of being in the world, and that way is better.
Right.
It's more attractive, it's more beautiful, it's more interesting, it's much more challenging, it's much more dangerous, but it's where I want to be, right? And I do recognize that the I want here is very ambiguous, right? I believe in original sin in a certain sense, right? So my I want is not I want to be good here. It's knowing that even my own desire here is deeply distorted, and at the same time, my project is to learn to desire to be with those I hate.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of enemies is one that some other pastor friends of mine are thinking through a lot. But I think that, when it comes to space, one of the things that I've sort of grown over time. I've been a pastor now for this, I guess, going into my 5th year. I think that part of what, I agree with you that if we keep playing the same sort of game back and forth, I mean, the United Methodist Church, for instance, has been fighting about inclusion since 1972. It's like the only thing that I've seen my church care about literally the entire time I've been a part of it. And, and that includes not caring about the Iraq War, while a president who was from our denomination was pushing it, selling it. And I think that ultimately, what the reality of this means is it's a challenge to this notion, I think, of progress, that somehow once we have had it out and the United Methodist Church is divorced with its conservative half or whatever else, that suddenly all these things will just be fine. I think what it's a call to is something a lot more local and a lot smaller. Like, the spaces where these things can become real are just the ones where you are existing and sort of moving through and trying to say, okay, actually, a church 100 yards from the University of Virginia and 2 miles from the place where there was a terrorist attack 2 years ago, and surrounded by Confederate monuments and the greatest economic inequality in Virginia, maybe just trying to figure that out is enough, enough for a lifetime. And I think that, so I guess all of this is just a call to say that, that I think notions of transformation have been given this kind of grandiose narrative that, and I think, this is obviously always the case during years where there are presidential campaigns, but that it's just one of the things that I've had to kind of learn over the years is that it's just so much smaller than that. And, I guess I would just say this as an encouragement to anyone listening that, from other pastors who are in contexts where they're preaching to non-affirming congregations or to people in non-affirming congregations having inclusive thoughts, that, just existing is in some ways a call to a greater freedom, I think, than taking on the burden of trying to transform a denomination of 12 million people into thinking the right way, or, a country into suddenly coming to its senses or anything like that. I mean, I don't know if any of that makes sense, if you want to tag onto it, but I think that maybe to sum up what we've been talking about is that community is a much smaller, like, we've been given less responsibility than we think, ultimately from God, in making all of this work.
As a last note, I think that's perfect and exactly right. The activist Mariam Kaba, Prison Culture on Twitter, who you probably know, talks about, hope as a discipline. And, I have this attachment to these very quote unquote problematic figures like Paul and like Martin Luther, right? And one of the things that I love so much about Luther is that moment when he says, in a certain sense, if graced, so small an act as bending down and picking up a piece of straw from the ground can be a good act. Let's do that in a way, right? Like, what he means by that is do the small thing in front of you right now. You can't, in a way, make yourself radically transformed overnight. And in fact, transformation isn't something over which we have control, right? We find ourselves transformed as we find ourselves in new relations with each other. So what can you do for that, right? Send money if you can. Do a different act if you can. Sure, vote. Sure, call legislators. Sure, do all those things. But your point is be in this community right here that's in front of you, with all the ambivalences and antagonisms that entails. And that's right. And that is the calling of the kingdom of God. There's no way around that.
Yeah. One last question that I swore I was going to get to that I haven't, and you can have as short of a response as possible because you've been really generous with your time, but in 5 sentences or less, should inclusive churches still use Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? I'm sorry, I get asked this question all the time, and I just wanted to get your take.
It's a really hard question. I don't think there's an ideal solution here. the best option is typically the proliferation of images rather than the belief in one correct image or the exclusion of any singular image. You know, I've used language of kingdom in this conversation. We know that that's ambivalent language.
Yeah.
There is something unnecessary, I think, in insisting that people for whom that language has really deep meaning give up, you know, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, as the case may be. That language is in the Bible. It's in the Bible. If you think that the Bible is going to have some liturgical function, that language is to some extent unavoidable. But that doesn't make it the singular language, nor does it necessarily make it the best language. There are, you know, to be sort of creative, to, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom or something like that around language is, I think, in practice going to be the very best option. And that includes, and in my view, very strongly should include, some of the language that was much more commonly used in earlier times than now, which is impersonal language, which is language that is maybe slightly less likely to cause us to, the technical language that one might use for this is like reify or hypostasize, that is to make into a controllable, visible image the otherness of God, the mysteriousness of God, the way that God completely confounds any sense that I have of who God is. So talk about the rock, talk about the lamb, talk about the lion, talk about the waterfall, the fountain, the, you know, use imagery that itself is internally contradictory enough. You'll never get it right because God moves, right? Just like bodies move, God moves. God can't be fixed in that way, but lots of different kinds of language will probably help to at least remind us of that movement. But that probably also does mean that being very, very strict about never ever using father-son language, that sort of attaches the whole thing to that language, just in the opposite way. Right. And I'm not a big, I think that's a mistake, actually.
Well, I think that people love to point out, but Jesus came from this very patriarchal society, and that's why he used that language. And I'm just like, okay, and where do we live?
Exactly. We come from a very patriarchal society. You know, anyway, you know, I've written about this, the sort of entanglement of that sort of move with racism and othering, right? And and the obvious anti-Semitism of it too. But anyway, there's a lot to explore there. Our language is not going to be perfect because we're not.
Yeah, because languages did not fall from heaven.
Exactly.
Yeah. Linn, thank you so much for your time. Is there any place where people can encounter you that you want to plug, or if other things that you'd like to shout out that you've worked on that people might be edified by if they've enjoyed this conversation?
The easiest way to reach me is email at my work email, linn.tonstad@yale.edu, or on my increasingly semi-professional Twitter, which is @Pinamiriel. If you know where that comes from, you are also a Tolkien nerd in an exceptional way. I picked that many years ago from an Elvish poem that he wrote. And anyway, embarrassing prehistories that we all have. In general, I'm just thrilled whenever there's a sort of engagement. You know, the Queer Theology book is an introduction, and it's also a polemic. And polemics expect, among many other reactions, pushback. So for me, there's many open, ongoing conversations here that I'm interested in having. But the sort of the ongoing questions around how this world can be changed and how we can be changed, for me, that's the central thing that brings Christianity and queerness together.
Well, I deeply regret not bringing up Tolkien, because we could go all day on that topic, including, you know, my vision for, you know, an actual theatrical version of the Silmarillion that I think would be
Oh no, okay, yeah. Some other time we'll definitely do that one. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.